He was hailed as the genius of blitzkrieg, the officer who could make tanks feel like chess pieces and sand look like a stage for victory. The poster boys called him the Desert Fox, audacious, resourceful, a commander who seemed to bend chaos to his will. And yet, by the middle of the war, the same class of men who once cheered his name began to question the man who had put them there, Adolf Hitler. They did not turn on him for a single reason. They began to defy him because military reality had collided with political madness, because reports of mass crimes eroded any moral blind faith, and because a desperate calculation to save what remained of Germany finally overrode personal loyalty. This is the real reason German officers began to defy Hitler. Not one epiphany, but a convergence of collapse, conscience, and survival. Rommel's rise makes that paradox more vivid than almost any other story from the European theater. He was not born into a position of grand privilege. A veteran of the First World War, he carried forward the hard lessons of maneuver and small unit daring into the interwar years. When the Wehrmacht exploded across Western Europe in 1940, Rommel's leadership in the assault on France stood out. Quick decisions, aggressive thrusts, a willingness to accept calculated risk. These were qualities military men respected and voters of propaganda adored. Germany needed heroes in 1940, and Joseph Goebbels provided them. Rommel emerged not merely as a field commander, but as an image, a face for recruitment posters, a name in newsreels, a simplified emblem of national pride. Even then, the relationship between soldier and politician was complicated. Rommel was a professional in uniform. He had an oath, a chain of command, and the instincts of a battlefield commander who measured success in ground gained and men saved. Yet he also accepted the honors of the regime. Propaganda wrapped his feats into a narrative that made war into spectacle and the commander into myth. Around him swirled the very apparatus that would later punish any hint of dissent. For a time, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. The regime gained a popular idol. Rommel gained rank and resources. But myth papered over contradictions. It obscured the growing gap between operational logic and political obsession. North Africa brought Rommel both glory and the first cruel lessons in the limits of individual brilliance against systemic failure. Sent to Libya in early 1941, he arrived with a small force and an outsized reputation. In the spinning, sunlit theater of desert warfare, his tactics produced dramatic results. He fought like a commander who treated movement itself as a weapon, pinning, outflanking, striking at points the enemy had left thin. Yet the campaign also exposed the Achilles heel of Axis strategy, logistics. The Mediterranean was not a friendly sea for supply lines.
Batteries of ships, newly efficient Allied air power, and the sheer weight of industrial production on the other side of the conflict meant that frontline audacity could be starved by supply failure. Allied intelligence amplified that structural weakness. Enigma decrypts, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and the steady growth of Allied naval and air power began to chip away at Axis operational surprise. The Allies, in other words, often knew where the Axis would try to move before those moves happened. That kind of edge does not merely cost battles, it costs faith. For commanders who had once trusted in decisive action, the realization that their adversary could anticipate maneuvers and choke off supplies carried a political sting. If decisions in Berlin were not solving these problems, who was making them? Who was responsible for the grand mismatch between tactical daring and strategic sustainability? By the autumn of 1942, the string of reverses tightened into a pattern. El Alamein was not simply a battlefield loss, it was a demonstration of material imbalance and of the limits that command can impose on even the most talented subordinates. Rommel faced defeats that were not obviously his to fix. His forces ran out of fuel, ammunition, and transport. Convoys were intercepted, and the strategic deck was stacked against him. His position, once celebrated, became a case study in how personality cannot substitute for industrial horsepower. Back in Berlin, there was a different logic at work. Hitler's rise to absolute control within the state had reshaped every decision. As the war went on, his personal authority tightened while his strategic judgment deteriorated. The man who once delegated battlefield command increasingly clung to operational details. Generals who had once reported on tactics found their strategic choices overruled by political directives. What might have been managed as a strategic withdrawal or a consolidation of forces was reframed as betrayal. Orders from the top increasingly demanded that territory be held at all costs. The Wehrmacht's culture of obedience ran straight into the Führer's obsession with symbolism of unbroken will. The winter of 1942–1943, marked by the catastrophe at Stalingrad, proved to be an inflection point for many professional soldiers. Stalingrad was different in scale and implication. It was not a localized defeat, it was a rupture. Entire armies encircled and wiped out under policies that refused retreat, even as tactical reality screamed for it. For officers trained to preserve combat power and to value calculated retreat as often as brave advance, the insistence on holding untenable positions struck as irrational at worst and criminal at best. The cost in lives, the senseless annihilation of divisions, made the question less about who led well and more about whether the leadership could be trusted at all. That erosion of confidence did not instantly turn generals into conspirators.
Many remained loyal in the old sense. They continued to serve, to fight, to carry out orders out of habit and duty. But loyalty became more narrow and instrumental. Where once it might have meant blind devotion to a person, it began to mean service to the nation as they imagined it, preservation of Germany, the survival of its institutions, or simply the rescue of what remained of their soldiers. In private conversations and in later memoirs, officers admitted to growing skepticism. Some spoke of shock at the scale of waste, others of disbelief at political idiocy. The cumulative effect was the same. The Führer's counsel could not be blindly trusted. Alongside strategic collapse, a moral dimension deepened. Reports of mass killings, of the brutal treatment of civilians, and of industrialized murder began to reach the fringes of military awareness. The Wehrmacht was not a blind bystander in all cases. The relationship between regular army units and SS or police formations was complex and varied across theaters. But what cannot be denied is that knowledge of atrocities, whether partial, second-hand, or direct, haunted the conscience of some officers. It shifted the moral calculus. For men whose identity was anchored in military honor, the idea of serving a state engaged in systematic criminality altered professional pride into moral unease. We must be careful here. The degree and depth of moral awareness among officers varied widely. Not every general reacted the same way. Some rationalized or compartmentalized, others turned away. Yet for a significant subset, the knowledge that state policy included mass murder made continued service to the head of state qualitatively different. It was no longer merely about winning or losing battles. It was about whether their actions enabled atrocities. Manfred Rommel, Erwin's son, later remembered the paradox surrounding his father. In the household memoirs, he described both adulation and strain. He recalled how the public adored the image of his father, the parades, the public attention, the steady stream of congratulatory messages, as if the man on the posters was an uncomplicated emblem of national pride. At the same time, he later reflected on the private burdens, nights when answers were sparse, when questions lingered unanswered, when the weight of command seemed heavier than the applause. Those recollections are personal and fragmentary. They do not provide a smoking gun, but they illuminate how a public symbol could carry private doubt. The German officer corps came to another uncomfortable recognition. Ideological fervor at the top eroded the professional autonomy of command. Hitler's practice of micromanagement, his habit of inserting himself into questions of disposition, timing, and even tactical choice, created repeated friction. Officers trained to account for terrain, logistics, and morale found their calculations overridden by political motives, symbolic stands, political theater, and the perverse prestige of holding territory for the sake of propaganda. In such an environment, competence and rational strategy became secondary to political considerations. That corruption of military judgment exacerbated losses and fed frustration among those who had to execute orders on the ground. Intelligence and deception sharpened that tension. Allied successes in signals intelligence, most famously in breaking the Enigma cipher, gave the British and Americans a clearer picture of Axis movements and supply lines. The Allies combined this with careful operational planning that exploited German vulnerabilities. It created an unfortunate loop. Bad strategic decisions by Berlin produced tactical opportunities that the Allies exploited, and those defeats fed back into the perception among officers that the political leadership was making choices divorced from practical military needs. The fall of North Africa in 1943 illustrated this feedback loop in brutal detail. Axis forces, beat back on multiple axes, were evacuated and surrendered in significant numbers. The loss of an entire theater of operations did not just remove personnel and material, it removed a psychological edge.
If the Wehrmacht could not even hold the Mediterranean flank, what hope remained for eventual victory on the European heartland, given the industrial and manpower superiority accruing to the Allies? This question moved from theoretical to existential in staff rooms and war councils. Rommel returned to Europe not as the unassailable idol he had been, but as an experienced commander who had seen the limits of boldness in the face of structural disadvantage. By late 1943, his reputation still carried weight. It is why he was assigned to the task of strengthening defenses in the West. The regime, for its part, remained eager to exploit his stature. Propaganda still found in him a useful figurehead. But the relationship between Rommel and Hitler had changed in tone, if not in public spectacle. Where there had once been a straightforward alignment, a tension now threaded beneath the surface. Rommel was a soldier trained to evaluate risk and conserve force. Hitler increasingly demanded heroics that had little to do with sound military judgment. When Rommel studied the Atlantic coast, what he saw alarmed him. The geography offered both opportunities and liabilities. A determined Allied amphibious landing, given air and naval superiority, could land decisively on the beaches and push inland faster than a static defense could respond. Rommel argued in broad terms and to those around him that to stop an invasion at the shoreline required robust local defenses, flexible reserves, and the freedom to employ armored counterattacks where they were most needed.
His immediate assessment contrasted sharply with the doctrine of centralized control favored by Hitler, who preferred to keep mobile armor under his direct command as a political tool rather than allow local commanders the discretion to employ it decisively. Beyond these technical disputes lay a deeper rupture. The hope some officers had harbored that competent military action might correct political mistakes was fading. Stalingrad had shown that battlefield catastrophe could be ordered from the top by insistence on holding the ground at any cost. North Africa had demonstrated that logistical shortfalls could undo any commander's ingenuity. And now, facing an inevitable threat across the Channel, many officers recognized a grim truth. If Germany were to be spared annihilation, drastic political choices would have to precede or accompany any military strategy. That realization did not automatically translate into plots or conspiracies. It did, however, push certain individuals toward alternatives they had previously dismissed. Some began to contemplate negotiations with the West as a lesser evil compared to total surrender to the Soviet Union or the continued butchery of a policy that had set the country on the path to ruin. Others imagined more extreme measures, up to and including the removal of Hitler. But for many, the practical question was simple. If the commander-in-chief would not temper his political obsessions with strategic realism, then the officer's duty to country might compel them to consider breaking from loyalty to him. There is a crucial moral nuance here. To speak of duty to country is not to exculpate the regime's crimes or to paint these officers as beneficent liberators. Many within the Wehrmacht remained deeply complicit in various forms of criminality. Others were indifferent. But the calculus that led some to resist combined patriotism, professional pride, and an emerging revulsion at the human cost of the regime's policies. Where did conscience end and pragmatism begin? The answer differed from man to man, but the pattern was consistent. Strategic failures made resistance conceivable. Moral knowledge made it urgent. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the strategic picture darkened further for Germany. The Allies built overwhelming force in Britain and the Mediterranean. Supplies and men flowed toward the invasion preparations. Allied deception plans would soon mislead German command about where the strike would fall. In the offices where Rommel and his peers deliberated, the question of how to meet an amphibious assault dominated every conversation. How could a defense be structured to meet a foe with superiority in ships, planes, and supplies? How long could a defensive line hold against the sheer tonnage of Allied material and momentum pushing toward Europe? For Rommel, this was not an abstract problem. He visited the coasts, inspected fortifications, and pressed for practical improvements.
He told colleagues that the decisive battle would in many ways be won or lost on the beaches and in the first hours and days after landing. For a commander once celebrated for moving fast and striking unexpectedly, the prospect of a slow attritional defense on fixed positions must have felt perverse. The irony was bitter. A man praised for audacity was now arguing for anticipatory measures and for tactical flexibility rarely given by the highest level of command. At this moment, a political culture that prized symbolism over pragmatism worked against effective defense. Hitler's insistence on controlling armored reserves, his mistrust of local commanders' discretion, and his preference for holding ground as a matter of honor all undermined the coherent use of forces. It also raised moral and legal questions. When the leader of the state redefines military necessity to match political theater,
officers are forced to choose whether to execute orders that potentially sacrifice troops for images or to refuse at great personal risk. Rommel's personal trajectory in late 1943 and early 1944 crystallizes these pressures. He was both insider and skeptic, a man whose fame the regime could not ignore and whose professional judgment increasingly ran against the political grain. He moved from the deserts of North Africa back to the banks of the Channel with a pragmatic plan for defense, a clear-eyed view of Allied capabilities, and an unease about the political willingness to grant the military the means to meet the threat effectively. The shift will be more visible in the coming chapters, how his operational concerns crossed into explicit warnings about the wider consequences of the regime's obstinacy, and how the cost of dissent would become, for him and others, unbearably high. But before that confrontation fully unfolds, there is another layer to the story that must be understood: the small, cumulative ways in which the Wehrmacht's culture was being eroded from within. Discipline and tradition had once been the pillars of professional pride, yet the war's attrition, the regime's politicization of the armed forces, the infiltration of ideological aims into strategic choices, and the increasing brutality of the conflict all corroded that ethic. Younger officers grew cynical, older ones grew frustrated. The officer corps ceased to be a monolith of uniform motives. It became, instead, a mosaic of competing values, some clinging to duty in the old sense, others reshaping duty into preservation of institutions, and a minority moving toward outright resistance. In staff rooms and on the fringes of confidence, plans were hatched, conversations took place, possibilities were weighed. Was it conceivable to remove the head of state without plunging the nation into civil war? Could a negotiated settlement with the Western Allies be reached in time to prevent Soviet occupation? These were practical questions, not merely moral dilemmas.
They were freighted with the bitter arithmetic of casualties, with the awareness that every month of continued fighting under Berlin's current direction multiplied the human toll. As winter thawed into spring of 1944, the tempo of events quickened. Intelligence, deception, and the weight of Allied preparation made invasion not a theoretical threat, but an imminent reality. For Rommel and others, the time for abstract worry was ending. The time for decisive judgment approached. The choices to be made were no longer purely professional. They would touch conscience, life, and death. They would test whether the military could, in the end, separate itself from the political order that had created it. The story of why German officers began to defy Hitler is a story of escalation. Small doubts compounded into strategic skepticism. Strategic skepticism, added to moral revulsion, hardened into a willingness to act. And the willingness to act collided with a regime that, for all its propaganda, was capable of ruthless retribution. Erwin Rommel's arc from desert hero to a man increasingly convinced that the war could not be won without reckless sacrifice provides a vivid lens to follow these shifts. He stood at the crossroads of reputation, responsibility, and conscience. What he saw at the Channel was not merely the outlines of beaches and defenses, but the shape of a national catastrophe that might yet be averted only by political decisions, not purely by military skill. Soon the lines between military assessment and political destiny would blur openly. Allied deception would play its hand. Armored divisions would be held like a political ace. Decisions made in Berlin would have direct consequences at dawn on the beach. The coming confrontation would force the officer corps to choose, whether to maintain the fiction of unbroken loyalty or to act in ways that might, in their view, save Germany from ruin. The calculus was never simple. It involved risk, moral compromise, and the knowledge that many acts of resistance would carry a private cost that could include death. In the months that followed Rommel's return to the West, those pressures intensified. Reports filtered back from the East and from occupied territories that made it impossible to keep moral blindness. Tactical reverses accumulated into strategic impossibility. The regime's response to even mild dissent hardened, and in the background, an Allied armada gathered, rehearsed, and prepared to strike. At the same time, within German circles, discussions about alternatives, some moderate, some radical, took on new urgency. Which path the officer corps would take depended on an interplay of motives: honor and pragmatism, revulsion and calculation, fear and courage. It is into this charged atmosphere that the decisive episodes of 1944 would arrive.
The next phase of this story follows Rommel from inspection tours of the Atlantic defenses into meetings with peers about what to do if the invasion came. It follows the widening gulf between military assessment and political resolve. It follows the private reckonings of men who had to decide whether to obey orders that meant annihilation or to risk everything in a bid to change the political command at the top. Those reckonings would not be uniform, they would not be clean, they would be messy and often morally ambiguous. But they would be decisive in determining why German officers began, in increasing numbers and with growing boldness, to question, to resist, and in some cases to defy Hitler. If the war was a machine, D-Day was the moment the gears finally ground down the illusion that brute will alone could steer the fate of nations. The invasion of June 6, 1944, did not merely open a Western front. It exposed, in daylight and chaos, the cumulative failures that had been building for years. For Erwin Rommel and the circle of senior officers around him, Normandy would crystallize what had long been suspected. The regime's political calculus was now directly at odds with military reality. It would also reveal how Allied skill, in planning, deception, and overwhelming material weight, could turn strategic truth into a moral imperative for those who still held rank and conscience. If you want the detailed maps and documentary evidence that underpin this narrative, stay with us through the next passages. The operational details are the evidence of motive. The Allies had prepared for invasion with a patience and a scale few imagined. The supremacy of ships and aircraft, the accumulation of men and materiel in southern England and the Mediterranean, and above all the meticulous deception plan codenamed Operation Fortitude, combined to mislead German assessments. Fortitude fed false signals about a threatened landing in the Pas-de-Calais, anchored German attention away from Normandy, and convinced many in Berlin and at army group levels that the main assault would come elsewhere. That misdirection worked in concert with German command culture. Hitler's instinct to hold the apparent center of attention and to keep his mobile reserves centrally controlled meant that the forces capable of rapid counterattack were often withheld from the actual points of landings. Rommel understood the danger with a clarity born of practical inspection tours. He had walked the beaches, watched the tides, measured the obstacles, and argued that the Allied strategy would exploit a single indispensable reality. Once men were ashore and given footholds, moving armor and creating local superiority would decide the battle. His solution was not mystical, it was doctrinal. He pushed for stronger beach defenses, for obstacles, anti-tank obstacles, and above all for giving local commanders the freedom to commit armored formations rapidly where the enemy landed.
His warnings were resolute because they were technical, not rhetorical, but their implications were political. If Hitler refused to allow that tactical flexibility, the defense would be hamstrung. That refusal was not abstract. Hitler, who had increasingly centralized authority over armor deployment, had a habit of treating mobile formations as strategic bargaining chips to be released at his discretion. He distrusted the commanders in the field and preferred to keep the strategic reserve under personal control, seeing it as the last guarantor of his will. The net effect was to place essential military tools in a bottleneck of political decision-making. When the landings began, the Allies combined surprise, local initiative, and relentless firepower. Airborne troops fought to hold inland bridges, beachheads were established amid chaos and carnage, and in the hours that followed, the Allies poured men and tanks ashore at a rate German planners had difficulty matching. For Rommel, watching from command posts and receiving field reports, the realization must have been bitterly immediate. The defenses he had argued for, to blunt the landing at the waterline and to counterattack before firm lodgements formed, were not being applied in the way he had recommended. Still, Normandy did not fail because of one man's prescriptions alone. It failed because the entire German system had been degraded by years of poor strategic judgment, depleted resources, and a culture of politicized command. When Hitler was slow to release armored reserves, or when military regions were left hamstrung by directive after directive, the Wehrmacht flowed from coherent fighting instrument into a reactive, fractious network of commands, trying to plug impossibly large holes. The Allied deception plans amplified that breakdown. Fortitude's success meant that even when critical decisions were made, they were often made with a distorted map of the enemy's intentions. Rommel recognized that the political reality had become a direct threat to national survival. He did not adopt messianic language. He did not call for revolution. Instead, he moved towards a narrow, pragmatic objective: prevent the destruction of Germany through negotiated terms with the Western Allies, while denying the Soviet Union the spoils of total occupation. His calculus was shaped both by military assessment and by fear.
fear for the millions who would be killed or subjected to further devastation if the war continued under current leadership. He believed that the West might offer comparatively moderate terms if approached, and he wanted to preserve what he considered the remains of the state and its institutions. It is crucial here to emphasize the moral ambiguity. Advocating for negotiation was not equal to opposing the regime's crimes. Rommel's primary concerns appear to have been strategic and national. Whether and how much moral revulsion toward Nazi atrocities factored into his thinking remains debated.
Some in his circle cited reports of atrocities and spoke of shame. Others were more driven by calculation. Manfred Rommel later recalled the private strain his father carried, a man revered publicly but haunted privately by the weight of command. Those recollections suggest that Rommel's motives were mixed, layered, and human rather than uniform. In mid-July 1944, Rommel acted decisively, at least on paper. He drafted a blunt communication urging consideration of negotiations with the Western powers. The letter, a direct challenge to the idea that military force alone could salvage the situation, called for political steps to avoid total collapse. It stopped short of endorsing assassination. Rommel favored legal and negotiated means to remove Hitler from power if possible. His approach mirrored the posture of several senior officers who saw negotiated transition as the least destructive route. Timing, however, conspired against him. On July 17th, a few days before the most famous conspiracy against Hitler would be attempted, Rommel suffered a serious car crash while returning from inspection. The injuries he sustained, both physical and, in the ways of command, symbolic, removed him from the immediate center of events. He would later recover to some degree, but the moment of crisis had begun to pass him by precisely when decisions were being forced upon others in Berlin. The July 20 plot, the Valkyrie conspiracy, that placed a bomb under a table in Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, unfolded in Rommel's absence. The plotters were a mixed coalition of officers, bureaucrats, and aristocrats, some motivated by moral horror, some by strategic despair, and some by an elite's fear of national ruin. The bomb failed to kill Hitler. In the chaotic hours that followed, the various coup elements across Berlin and elsewhere attempted to seize control under the pretext of Operation Valkyrie. Their plan depended on secure lines of communication and the willingness of key commanders to back the action. Rommel's exact relationship to the plot remains contested. Some conspirators had discussed the removal of Hitler with him at an operational level. Others hoped he would lend legitimacy to a post-Hitler government. But historians and contemporaries have cautioned against simple attribution. Rommel had made no secret of his desire to see leadership changed. He had advocated negotiation rather than assassination. Whether he had given active consent to a plot contingent on success, or whether he was simply seen as a potential ally by conspirators seeking reputable military figures, is a question that lodges in the realm of plausible inference rather than settled fact. What is clear is that after July 20, the regime's response was unforgiving. Hitler's reaction to Valkyrie was savage and swift. The SS and the Gestapo moved to dismantle the networks of dissent, imprisoning, torturing, and executing conspirators and suspected sympathizers.
Trials were showpieces for vengeance. Lists of officers and civilians were compiled and purged. The purge's breadth was intended to send a message. Dissent would no longer be tolerated, and the security apparatus would reach into even the highest ranks. The cost in lives and careers was enormous, and the chilling effect on any remaining conspiratorial sentiment was immediate. Rommel's situation was peculiar and emblematic. He was a figure too prominent to be handled with ordinary judicial steps without political fallout. The regime was aware of his public stature, the international symbolism of his name, and the risk that harsh punishment might turn him into martyr. Yet the regime also needed to demonstrate that no one, however famous, was beyond accountability. The resulting solution combined coercion with theater. Rommel was summoned, or his family was summoned, depending on accounts, and presented with an ultimatum. He could be brought before a court and face disgrace and public trial, or he could die discreetly in a way that allowed the state to preserve a facade, a hero's funeral, official commendations, and the restoration of a public image useful for morale.
On October 14th, Rommel died after taking poison. The circumstances were, in effect, forced. Someone in authority, empowered by Hitler's inner circle, offered him this choice and orchestrated an appearance of control. The state arranged for headlines, for official mourning, and for propaganda to frame his passing as the loss of a national hero. Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda managed ceremonies and narratives to ensure that Rommel's name remained an instrument of state cohesion even in death. For the regime, this was a final demonstration. Dissent could be neutralized, sanitized, and turned into spectacle. But the deeper lesson of Rommel's end was not merely about spectacle. It was emblematic of the regime's capacity to convert complexity into certainty through violence and manipulation. By removing potential high-profile critics and by conducting highly public reprisals, the state sought to close the space for meaningful institutional resistance. For other officers, the message resounded: even those once elevated by the regime were expendable. The immediate aftermath of the July 20 conspiracy and subsequent purges hardened the officer corps. Many who might have entertained bold action were cowed. Others fled into silence or full cooperation. Yet, paradoxically, the attempt and its repression also confirmed for some the necessity of resistance, if only it could be done in ways that avoided the catastrophic reprisals they had just witnessed. The practical consequence was a narrowing of options and a hardening of motives. Those who still refused to bow to Hitler's command had to choose subtler paths or accept martyrdom.
From a structural perspective, the period illustrates the central thesis. Officers began to defy Hitler because a trinity of forces had collided: strategic collapse, moral revulsion, and a pragmatic desire to preserve what remained of Germany. Normandy and the Western Campaign exposed the first. Military competence without strategic resources was insufficient. Intelligence failures, or rather political misuse of intelligence, made those shortcomings lethal. Stalingrad and the loss of North Africa had demonstrated the second. An ideological leadership willing to sacrifice armies for symbolic ends had become untrustworthy by professional military standards. Reports, rumors, and in some cases direct encounters with atrocity introduced the third. The moral cost of service under a system engaged in industrialized murder could no longer be ignored by certain officers, at least not without a change in conscience. And the cumulative effect of these elements produced a final imperative in the minds of many: preserve the nation, however imperfectly, by removing the leadership that had steered it to ruin. Yet it is equally crucial to insist on nuance. The motives of officers were not monolithic. For some, the impetus was patriotic preservation, a desire to prevent Soviet occupation and to protect what remained of German institutions. For others, moral revulsion at crimes committed in the name of the state sharpened their will. For many, motives blended into a pragmatic calculation that the war could not be won, and that continued fighting only meant senseless bloodshed. There were also those whose resistance was minimal or purely opportunistic, aimed less at rescuing souls than at protecting personal honor or property. Any narrative that conflates the full spectrum of officer motives into a single heroic thread does violence to the historical record. The cost of dissent was enormous and instructive. Public trials, execution lists, purges of command, and the social ostracism of families communicated a ruthlessness intended to neutralize opposition. The regime's propaganda apparatus rewove images to maintain continuity, turning coerced suicides into state funerals and converting complex biographies into easy symbols. These maneuvers show how power can recompose narrative to its own ends, and how dangerous it is for officers who sought to challenge a system that controlled both force and narrative. What then is the concise answer to the title's question? Why did German officers begin to defy Hitler in World War II? The short response is this: they did so because the facts on the ground made continued loyalty both morally compromised and strategically irrational. Repeated military disasters, Stalingrad, the collapse in North Africa, the inability to repel the invasion in the West, exposed the gap between political theater and military necessity.
Knowledge of atrocities, in varying degrees, made serving the regime feel different in kind, not merely in degree, and the looming specter of total national ruin drove officers to prioritize preservation over fidelity to a single leader. Those motives combined into a pragmatic, often desperate resolve to act, sometimes illegally and sometimes painfully, to halt a course that promised annihilation. Rommel's life and death offer a concentrated case study of these dynamics. He began the war as a celebrated commander who embodied the image of military efficiency,
Over time, he encountered the structural limits of individual brilliance, the corrosive effects of political meddling, and the moral ambiguities of serving a criminal state. His advocacy for negotiation, his sidelined timing during the July plot, and his coerced death reveal how a man of great military gifts could end up at odds with the very leadership that had elevated him. The legacy is complicated. After the war, many in the West preferred a simplified account, Rommel, the apolitical professional who stood apart from crimes, because it served political and cultural reconciliation narratives. But a sober historical reckoning resists simplification. Rommel was not a saint and not a full collaborator in criminality. He was a soldier navigating impossible choices within a criminal regime. Understanding why officers defied Hitler means refusing easy absolution, and instead recognizing the tangled motives, technical judgment, moral revulsion, and an urgent pragmatic desire to prevent total ruin. When historians sift through this period, they find no single tidy cause. They find instead an accumulation of pressures that, when combined, made the choice to defy not merely conceivable, but for some, necessary. Duty to country, duty to soldiers, duty to conscience. These duties collided and reordered priorities. For some officers, that reordering meant quiet acts of obstruction. For others, it meant participation in conspiracies. For a few, it meant paying with their lives. The story ends, finally, with a warning and a charge. It warns of the corrosive power of politicized command and the danger of subordinating professional judgment to symbolic politics. It charges us to remember that resistance is rarely pure and often costly, that those who act against tyrants do so with mixed motives and grave risks. Above all, it insists that moral clarity and strategic realism can and at times must converge, because the alternative is prolonged destruction, a lesson the mid-war German officer corps learned too late and at a terrible price. If you found this deep dive illuminating and want more long-form explorations of World War II turning points and the people who shaped them, subscribe and check the links in the description for further reading and source documents.